Welcome to A Guided Life podcast, where we talk about all things spirit and life. I'm your host, Laura West. Through a mix of solo and interview episodes, I want to showcase all the different ways the spirit world helps guide our daily lives. Whether it's through intuition, signs, mediumship, channeling, the mystical, or the paranormal, our altruistic spirit guides and other members of our loving soul team are always there, ready, able, and willing to guide us. Have you ever finished a book and then just sat there? Like you close it, stare at the wall for a minute, and suddenly your actual life feels just a little less magical? Because that's been me lately. In case you didn't know, I've completely fallen down the fourth wing rabbit hole. And honestly, I wasn't expecting it. I did read the Akotar series and I went down that rabbit hole. I love authors like Scarlett St. Clair and Amelia Hutchins, but somehow I found myself staying up way too late reading about dragon riders, and not just reading, but thinking about the characters while I'm making dinner, wondering what happens next while I'm folding laundry, and picking the book back up every chance I get like I'm 16 years old again. And it got me thinking, why? Why are so many adults absolutely obsessed with fantasy right now? Why are millions of people reading books about dragons and magic, fairies, enchanted forests, and impossible worlds? And maybe an even better question, why do some people feel almost embarrassed to admit that they love them? It's funny because if someone says they're reading a business book or a biography, people tend to nod in approval. Oh, you're learning. But if someone says they're spending their weekend reading about dragon riders or magical courts or wizards, there's almost this unspoken assumption that it's frivolous, it's escapism, something you should grow out of. And I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think fantasy might be giving us something we're desperately missing. Today, I want to explore why stories matter so much, not just because they're entertaining, but because I think they're helping us reconnect with parts of ourselves that adulthood slowly teaches us to forget. And before you think, well, Laura, I don't read fantasy, stay with me because this episode isn't really about dragons. It's about being human. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is how strange adulthood really is. Think about it. When we're children, imagination isn't something we have to make time for. It is our life. A cardboard box becomes a spaceship. The floor becomes lava. A stick becomes a sword. We spend hours creating worlds that don't exist. And nobody questions it. They tell us imagination is healthy. Creativity is important. Play helps us learn. But then something happens. Somewhere along the way, we quietly absorb this idea that growing up means becoming more practical, more productive and realistic. And then suddenly we're praised for answering emails instead of daydreaming, for checking things off a to-do list instead of wondering, for being efficient instead of curious. Without even realizing it, many of us trade awe for obligation. And I don't think our brains were ever designed to live that way. Because here's what's fascinating. Psychologists have found that our brains don't simply enjoy stories. They're actually wired for them. Long before we had books, long before podcasts, Netflix, we had stories. Stories were how humans taught survival, how we passed on wisdom, and how we explained the stars. It's how we built communities. Stories are one of the oldest technologies we have. And here's what I love. Your brain doesn't experience a great story the same way it experiences a list of facts. When you're immersed in a story, multiple regions of your brain light up simultaneously. If someone simply tells you, the character climbed the mountain, your language centers activate. But if you're emotionally invested in that character, your sensory cortex begins imagining the climb, and your emotional centers respond to their fear. Your brain starts simulating the experience. It's almost like your mind whispers, what if this were happening to me? And maybe that's exactly why stories change us. not because they tell us what to think, but because they allow us to experience something emotionally before we've ever lived it ourselves. And I think that's where fantasy becomes even more interesting, because fantasy doesn't just tell stories, it removes us from reality entirely. Which sounds like escapism, but I actually think there's something much deeper happening. So maybe the question isn't, why do we escape into fantasy? Maybe the better question is, what are we finding there that we are missing here? Because I think we've misunderstood the word escape. When people hear that someone is escaping into a fantasy world, there's often this assumption that they're avoiding their life, that they're running away from reality. But I think there's a really important distinction here. There is a difference between avoidance and restoration. Avoidance says, I don't want to deal with my life. Restoration says, I need something that helps me return to my life differently. And I think that's what a great story can do. Think about the last time you finished a book that really moved you. Maybe you cried, laughed, maybe you felt like you had just spent days with people who don't technically exist, and then something interesting happens. You close the book, but you don't leave the experience behind. You carry something back with you. Maybe it's a new perspective. Maybe it's courage. Maybe it's the reminder that you want to live more boldly. Maybe it's simply the feeling of wonder. And that feeling matters. There is actually a concept in psychology called awe. And I think awe is one of the missing ingredients in modern life. Awe is that feeling you get when you encounter something so vast, so beautiful, or so extraordinary that it expands your sense of what's possible. It's standing under a sky full of stars. It's seeing the ocean for the first time. It's hearing a song that makes you stop what you're doing. It's watching a sunrise or a sunset. It's opening a book and entering a world where dragons exist and magic is real. And here's what's fascinating about awe. It changes the way we see ourselves. Because when we experience awe, we temporarily step outside our small, everyday concerns. The email we haven't answered, the laundry sitting in the dryer, the conversation we keep replaying, the worry we've been carrying for weeks. For a moment, we remember that there is more and that there is something bigger than this one stressful moment. There is something beyond our immediate circumstances. And I think that's one reason fantasy can feel almost medicinal, because so many of us are living lives where everything is measurable. Our schedules, productivity, bank accounts, accomplishments, goals. And fantasy reminds us that not everything meaningful can be measured. I think one of the saddest things about growing up is that we often confuse maturity with losing wonder. We start believing that being an adult means seeing through everything. It's being logical or realistic. And yes, there is value in those things. We need discernment and we need wisdom. But I think we sometimes forget that wonder and wisdom can exist together. Actually, some of the wisest people I know are the ones who have stayed curious, the ones who can still be amazed, and the ones who can still look at the world and say, isn't this incredible? Isn't this incredible? Fantasy gives us permission to do that. It invites us back into curiosity. And maybe that's why so many adults are finding these stories right now. Because our world is incredibly complicated. We are constantly surrounded by information, constantly getting notifications, given opinions, feeling pressure to optimize ourselves. And then we open a book and enter a world where the biggest question is something ancient and simple. Who am I? What am I willing to fight for? Who do I love? What am I afraid of? What kind of person am I becoming? Those questions are not fantasy questions. Those are human questions. And this brings me to something else I've been thinking about. Why do we become so attached to fictional characters? Why do people cry over characters who were never real? Why do we feel heartbreak when a character dies? Why do we miss a world we can never actually visit? I think the answer is because our brains are less concerned with whether something is technically real. Our brains are wired for meaning. When we connect with a character, we're not just connecting with a fictional person. We're connecting with something that character represents. The brave part of ourselves, or the wounded part of ourselves, or the part of ourselves that wants to be chosen, the part that wants to belong, or maybe the part that wants to discover that we are capable of more than what we thought. And this is where fantasy becomes incredibly powerful. Because fantasy characters often represent exaggerated versions of our own internal journeys. Fantasy characters, they face impossible odds. They lose everything. They discover hidden strength and they find unexpected allies. They transform. And maybe the reason we love these stories isn't because we wish we were fighting with dragons. Maybe it's because deep down, we recognize that we are all fighting our own versions of dragons. Now, without getting into spoilers, one thing that connects so many beloved fantasy stories is transformation. So think about Harry Potter. At its heart, it's not really a story about spells. It's a story about a person discovering who he is, finding belonging, and choosing love over fear. Think about A Court of Thorns and Roses. At its heart, it's not just about fairies or magical courts. It's about identity, survival, healing, and discovering that the person you thought you were may not be the person you become. And Fourth Wing, at its core, it's not only about dragons, it's about stepping into an environment where fear is unavoidable and discovering maybe I am stronger than I thought. And I think that's why these stories resonate, because we all have moments where life asks us to become someone new. A new career, a new relationship, a loss, a transition, or a version of ourselves we don't recognize yet. Fantasy gives us a symbolic language for those moments. It gives us dragons for our fears, quests for our challenges, magic for our potential, and heroes who remind us that transformation is possible. And maybe that's the real magic. Not that these worlds are imaginary, but that they reveal something very real about us. They show us the parts of ourselves we sometimes forget. Our courage, our creativity, our ability to change, our desire for connection, and our need to believe that something meaningful is still possible. And in the next section, I want to talk about something I think is especially interesting. The hero is almost never the person you would expect at the beginning. They usually don't start out powerful. They don't start out confident. They don't start out knowing exactly who they are. Actually, most of the time, they start out feeling like the opposite. They feel ordinary, unprepared, different, like they don't quite belong. And maybe that's one of the biggest reasons we connect with them. Because if we're honest, most of us don't walk around feeling like the main character. Most of us are not waking up every morning thinking, I know exactly who I am. I know my purpose. I know what I'm capable of. I'm completely confident and ready for whatever life throws at me. Usually it's more like, I hope I'm doing this right. Am I making the right decision? Am I actually capable of this? Why does everyone else seem like they have it figured out? And I think fantasy gives us a really beautiful reminder. The people we admire most are not people who never felt afraid. They're people who moved forward while they were afraid. I think one of the biggest traps that we fall into as adults is waiting to feel ready. We tell ourselves, when I feel more confident, I'll start. When I know more, I'll try. When I'm less afraid, I'll take the leap. But confidence rarely comes before action. Usually, confidence is something we build by taking action. It's created through evidence. Every time we do something difficult and survive it, we teach ourselves, maybe I can handle more than I thought. And this is something fantasy understands incredibly well. The hero doesn't become the hero because they suddenly wake up with all the answers. They become the hero because life places them in situations where they have to discover what they're capable of. Think about some of our favorite characters. Harry Potter doesn't begin his story knowing he's brave. He doesn't know he's capable of facing darkness. He doesn't even fully understand why he's different. He's just a kid who has spent his life feeling overlooked and misunderstood. But through every challenge, every friendship, and every choice, he discovers himself. The bravery comes through the journey, not before it. And I think this is why so many people connect with characters like this, because somewhere inside, we recognize that same process in ourselves. There are versions of us that existed before we knew what we know now, before we healed or grew, and before we learned how strong we actually were. Sometimes we look back and think, I can't believe I survived that. I can't believe I made that decision. And I can't believe I became that person. And that's because we often don't recognize our own transformation while we're in the middle of it. We're too busy living it. Another reason fantasy resonates so deeply is because so many fantasy stories are built around the underdog, the person everyone underestimates, the one who doesn't fit the traditional image of power. And I think that's deeply meaningful because most of us know what it feels like to feel underestimated. Maybe not by an entire kingdom or a magical institution, but by life. Maybe you've been told, that's unrealistic. That's not practical. That's not who you are. Why would you do that? And sometimes those voices come from other people, but sometimes they're our own. Sometimes the biggest person standing in our way is the version of ourselves that has decided what is and isn't possible. This is something I think Fourth Wing explores in a really interesting way. Without getting into spoilers, one of the themes that stands out is the idea that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. We often assume strength is obvious, that it's physical, it's loud, it's fearless, but some of the strongest people are the ones who have learned how to adapt. They've learned how to observe and how to think differently or how to continue despite uncertainty. And I think that's such an important reminder because we all have things about ourselves that we may have labeled as weaknesses that might actually become our greatest strengths. So maybe you're sensitive, maybe you're deeply emotional, maybe you notice things other people miss, maybe you think differently, or maybe you take longer to make decisions because you consider everything. The world often tells us to fix those parts of ourselves, but sometimes those are the very things that make us powerful. Another reason fantasy stories are so powerful is because nobody becomes the hero alone. And I think this is one of the most beautiful lessons in these books. The idea that transformation happens through connection. We are shaped by the people who walk beside us. Almost every great fantasy story includes some version of a found family. The people who see you before you fully see yourself. The people who remind you who you are when you forget. The people who challenge you and the people who stand with you. And honestly, I think this resonates so deeply because belonging is one of our most fundamental human needs. We are not designed to go through life completely alone. We need people who know our stories, people who celebrate our victories, and those who sit with us in the hard moments. We need people who say, I see something in you that you may not see yet. And maybe that's another reason we love fantasy, because these stories remind us that connection is part of becoming. We don't transform in isolation. We transform in relationship. So maybe the question isn't, am I already the person I want to become? Maybe it's more, what is this chapter of my life asking me to learn? Or what part of myself am I being invited to discover? Or maybe even what strength is developing because of what I'm walking through? Because the truth is, every person listening to this episode is somewhere in their own story. Maybe you're in the beginning, the part where nothing makes sense yet. Maybe you're in the middle, the messy part where you're being challenged and changed. Maybe you're in a chapter where you finally realize, I made it through something I never thought I would. But wherever you are, the story isn't finished. And maybe that's the most comforting thing fantasy reminds us of. The beginning of the story is not the end of the story. And this leads me to something I think is even more fascinating, because if fantasy stories are really about transformation, then the monsters and villains aren't just there to create conflict. They serve a deeper purpose. They represent something every human being has to face: our own shadows, the fears we avoid, the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. One of my favorite things about fantasy is that the challenges are never just physical. Yes, there are battles, there are creatures, and there are impossible obstacles, but underneath all of that, the real battle is usually internal. The hero isn't just fighting something outside of themselves, they're confronting something within themselves. And I think that's why these stories stay with us, because deep down we understand something. The hardest battles we face are rarely just about what is happening around us. They're about who we are becoming because of what is happening around us. Think about the role of a dragon in a fantasy story. A dragon is powerful. It's intimidating. It's something you don't casually walk toward. And in many ways, that's exactly why dragons make such a powerful symbol, because we all have dragons. Not literal ones, obviously, but things that feel too big to face. Things like fear, grief, change, uncertainty, perhaps a conversation we've been avoiding, or a dream we've convinced ourselves is impossible, or a truth we've been unwilling to admit. Our dragons are the things that make us want to run. And yet, in almost every great story, the hero eventually has to stop running. They have to turn around and they have to face the thing that they've been afraid of. This actually connects to a concept from psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow self. The shadow is not the quote unquote bad part of us. It's not some evil version of ourselves hiding in the basement. The shadow is simply the parts of ourselves that we haven't fully accepted, the emotions we don't want to feel, or the traits we don't want to admit we have, or the experiences we haven't processed. It's the part of ourselves that we've pushed away because they didn't fit the version of ourselves we wanted to be. Maybe it's anger or jealousy, insecurity, or the desire to be seen. Maybe it's the part of you that wants more from life that feels guilty admitting it. And here's the interesting thing about the shadow. What we reject often has the most power over us, because anything we refuse to acknowledge tends to operate in the background. And this is why I think fantasy villains are so fascinating. The best villains aren't just evil for the sake of being evil. The best villains usually represent something. They can represent a warning or a possibility or a path the hero could have taken. Because the truth is, the line between hero and villain is often not whether someone experiences pain. Everyone experiences pain. The difference is what they do with it. This is something I love about stories like Harry Potter. At the center of the series is this question: what shapes a person more, the circumstances they were born into or the choices they make? And I think that's one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves too, because we all have things that happen to us that we didn't choose. We all have moments that hurt us. We all have chapters we wish had been different, but our stories are not only defined by what happened to us, they're also defined by what we choose next. Something else I've noticed about fantasy is that the worlds are often incredibly dangerous. There are monsters, political conflicts, life or death decisions. Characters are constantly being tested. And yet, many of us find these worlds comforting. Isn't that interesting? Why do you feel safe reading about characters facing impossible danger? I think part of the answer is because fantasy creates a controlled environment for exploring fear. In real life, uncertainty can feel overwhelming. The unknown is scary because we don't know how the story ends. But in a book, we can experience uncertainty alongside a character. We can watch someone face the impossible, and we can watch them struggle and then grow. And somewhere along the way, we learn that if they can face that, maybe I can face my thing too. And maybe the most beautiful lesson is this: sometimes the thing we fear is not actually our enemy. Sometimes it's the doorway. Think about how many fantasy stories involve a character discovering that the thing they were afraid of was also connected to their growth. The challenge reveals something, the obstacle develops something, and the journey transforms something. And I think life works the same way. Sometimes the thing we are desperately trying to avoid is the very thing that is asking us to grow. It could be the difficult conversation, the uncomfortable transition, the ending we didn't want, the beginning we didn't feel ready for, the moment where we have to say, I can't continue being the person I've always been. I think that's why fantasy stories can feel so personal, because beneath the magic, they are stories about becoming. They are stories about identity, about letting go of old versions of ourselves. It's about discovering strength we didn't know we had, about realizing that the thing we thought would destroy us actually introduced us to a deeper version of ourselves. So I want to invite you to think about this. What is your dragon right now? Not the thing that is dramatic or obvious, not necessarily the biggest problem in your life, but what is the thing you keep circling around? The thing you keep saying, maybe later, I'll deal with that eventually when things calm down. What is the thing that keeps showing up? Because sometimes the things that keep showing up are invitations. They're not punishments, but they're invitations to grow and to become and to meet a version of ourselves that we haven't discovered yet. I think that's one of the greatest gifts of fantasy. It reminds us that transformation is possible because every hero begins somewhere. They begin uncertain, afraid. They begin before they know how the story ends, just like we do. And this brings us to one of my favorite parts of any fantasy story, the idea of becoming someone new. Because every great fantasy story is ultimately a transformation story. The character starts as one person, and through everything they experience, they become someone else. But here's the thing. I don't think we ever stop having transformation stories. We don't have one defining moment where we finally, quote unquote, arrive. We are always becoming. I think one of the most beautiful things about stories is that they don't actually end when we reach the final page. The book closes, the movie credits roll, the song ends, but something remains. A feeling, a memory, a question, a different way of seeing ourselves. And maybe that's because stories are never just about the characters. They're about us. The reason a story resonates isn't just because something interesting happens to someone else. It's because somewhere inside that story, we recognize something true about ourselves. Think about the stories that have stayed with you throughout your life. Maybe it was a childhood book or a movie you watched over and over. Maybe it was a character who felt like a friend during a difficult season, or a fictional world you returned to when you needed comfort. Why do we do that? Why do certain stories become almost like emotional homes for us? Well, I think it's because stories help us make sense of our own experiences. They give us language for things we sometimes can't explain. They give us metaphors for feelings that are difficult to name. They show us that other people, even fictional ones, have struggled with fear, loneliness, uncertainty, grief, and change. And somehow, through their journeys, we feel a little less alone in ours. One thing I love about fantasy is that it reminds us life is not just a collection of random events. Humans naturally search for meaning. We want to understand where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. We want our experiences to fit into a larger story. And I think this is why the hero's journey has lasted for thousands of years, because it's not really just a storytelling formula. It's a reflection of being human. The ordinary world, the call to change, the fear of leaving what is familiar, the challenges, the moments where we question ourselves, the people who help us, the version of ourselves we leave behind, the person we become. We see this pattern everywhere because we live this pattern. And maybe that's why fantasy can feel so comforting during uncertain seasons, because fantasy stories remind us that the middle of the story is messy. The middle is where the hero gets tested. The middle is where things don't make sense, where they question themselves and where they wonder, am I actually capable of this? And I think so many of us are living in the middle right now. Maybe you're rebuilding something, or you're trying something new, or you're letting go of an old identity. Maybe you're becoming someone your younger self wouldn't even recognize. And sometimes when we're in that messy middle, we assume something has gone wrong. But fantasy reminds us the middle is where transformation happens. I think that's the secret gift of fantasy. It doesn't just take us somewhere else, it brings something back. When we finish a great story, we return to our own lives, but maybe we return slightly changed. Maybe we are a little more courageous, a little more hopeful, a little more open. And maybe we remember that life is not just about completing tasks, it's about experiencing connection, maybe even about discovering what matters. And I think this is especially important right now because we live in a world that constantly encourages us to become more efficient, productive, optimized. But fantasy reminds us to become more alive and to wonder, to imagine and to create and to feel, to believe that there is still beauty in the unknown. So if you love fantasy, if you've ever over a fictional character, if you've ever wished you could step into another world, and if you've ever stayed up too late reading because you couldn't bear to leave the story, I want you to know something. That part of you is not childish. That part of you is not something you need to outgrow. That part of you is deeply human. The part of you that longs for magic is the same part of you that longs for possibility. The part of you that loves impossible worlds is the same part of you that believes your own life can still surprise you. And the part of you that roots for heroes is the same part of you that knows you are capable of courage. Maybe we don't love fantasy because we want to escape our lives. Maybe we love fantasy because it reminds us how much our lives matter. Because every great fantasy story asks the same questions. Who are you becoming? What are you willing to fight for? What kind of love will you choose? What fear will you face? What magic will you bring into the world? And maybe those aren't fantasy questions at all. Maybe they're the questions we should all be asking ourselves. So this week, I want to invite you to think about a story that has stayed with you. Not just your favorite story, but the one that changed something inside of you. The one that gave you courage. The one that helped you through something. The one that reminded you of a part of yourself you had forgotten. And then ask yourself, what did this story awaken in me? Because I believe the stories we are drawn to often reveal something about who we are becoming. And maybe that's the real magic. Not that dragons exist or that magic spells are real, but that a story written by someone you've never met can reach across time and space and remind you of something you already carried inside yourself. Thank you for spending this time with me today and for exploring this little corner of curiosity, psychology, and imagination with me. And if you love this episode, I hope you'll share it with someone who also believes that maybe growing up doesn't mean leaving magic behind. Maybe it means learning how to find it everywhere. So until next time, stay guided. And that was another episode of a Guided Life podcast. To connect with me via my socials or for links to my book titled Guided or my card deck called From Your Spirit Guides, please visit my Linktree site at linktr.ee/guidedwest. Thanks so much for tuning in, and until next time, love and light always.